What is Dark Millennium? Is it an expansion for Warhammer 40,000 2nd edition? Or is it more? In this video, we'll look into this issue and have a look at what made this an essential buy for any discerning 40k player of that era, and why it may be something you may wish to lay your hands on in 2025. I'm Matthew, this is Miniscape. Welcome! "1993 saw the release of the 2nd edition of Warhammer 40k. You may have seen the iconic box art, or you may be fortunate enough to still own a copy, which came with 80 plastic miniatures, rules, lore, templates, dice, and cards required for gameplay. And let's not forget that adorable little orc Dreadnought in card standee form. A year later, Games Workshop released a boxed expansion for 2nd edition 40k called Dark Millennium. No miniatures in this one, but if it had the monopoly on anything, it was cardboard. So much lovely cardboard, of various thicknesses and size, some with round corners and some with square corners. Templates, Wargear cards and vehicle upgrades, warp cards, psychic powers and strategy cards. And of course, a rulebook to guide you in using them with your games. It was a box of potential to take your games of Warhammer 40,000 to the next level. White Dwarf magazines 170 and 171 cover the launch of this set, which cost £19.99 on release here in the UK. Issue 170 had an article building anticipation for release of the expansion. It said, "The material in Dark Millennium was developed alongside the Warhammer 40,000 game itself. We quickly realized that it would be impossible to fit everything inside the original game box. There was simply too much. As a consequence, we decided to hive off the majority of the vehicle datafacts cards and the psychic cards into a supplement. These two substantial card sets are the heart of the Dark Millennium supplement, although there are plenty other extras too, including no less than 55 more Wargear cards. So really, this was more of the rest of the edition rather than an expansion. A set which was the icing on the cake, if you will, always meant to be there, just as planned." The text earlier on also reveals that this was released before Codex Space Wolves, which was the first codex for this edition. So, shall we get our teeth into this treasured relic? Let us begin with the box art by Jeff Taylor, shared with the front cover of the rulebook and the cover of White Dwarf issue 170. It is as epic as it is iconic. A Dark Angel army pushing forward against the backdrop of striding titans and fluttering banners. An impressive sight to be sure, and a welcome companion to the original 2nd edition box art. The protagonist is this chap, a Dark Angel captain with ornate power armor, dominated by his formidable pauldrons, and in White Dwarf 174, there's even a model of him converted by Mike McVeigh. There's a lot going on here. Like many of these classic art pieces, they could keep you staring at them for hours. But this isn't an art video, so let's flip over the box and see what's going on there. Like many boxes, this box has a back. And what a back. For one, it outlines the full contents, which are as follows: 60 psychic cards for the existing factions, 24 vehicle data cards, 8 psychic power templates, 10 vehicle upgrade cards, 55 Wargear cards, 18 strategy cards, 4 mission cards, 36 warp cards, 9 counters, and the Dark Millennium rulebook. And here it is, all fanned out in better style than a Blackpool casino. And below that is a warning that this is not a full game, but possession of the Warhammer 40,000 game is also necessary. It's a stern warning in red shouty caps, but also a vague one, because how does one possess the Warhammer 40,000 game anyway? Is it through some kind of arcane ritual? Probably not. That would be silly. Before we open the box, a couple of things still need to be discussed. Firstly, the condition. Of course, this is second-hand, and the box has clearly been handled, loved, and sanded down in places. Oh, and sellotaped back together around the corners. Still, I feel like I have bought more than a supplement here second-hand, but also a fraction of a person's adolescence. Anyway, as was the style at the time, the edges of the bottom half of the box are arrayed with photographs of the studio miniatures in a dynamic scene. This one gets me going right away, mainly because it has a Land Raider, but also because it shows some Tyranid models, and it's these kind which I owned some of as a lad, including some of these rather paltry-looking warriors, which I bought from a friend in the schoolyard second-hand, the monies of which would go to fund his electric guitar obsession. And if you're listening, good for you, John. Then, less interesting to me, but also impressive, we have this scene of Yarick taunting some orcs from his bunker, much like a French John Cleese taunting the knights from the castle in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And it's nice to see there's some Eldar dancing before the Space Wolves. Let's just take a moment to love this dude with the rainbow mohawk. Next we have Blood Angels and Space Orcs. If you count the points in this scene, and I won't be, you get a good idea about how screwed the orcs are. Even if it is their turn, they can't charge everyone, though that shock attack gun at the back can definitely ruin someone's day. That's what I like about these photos, the chance to speculate over what will happen next. Finally, we have some Eldar and Gene Stealers, next to Deathwing Terminators, encountering some Khorne Berserkers. As mentioned, Dark Millennium came with a rulebook, so let's start working our way through that and review the content in there. The most common resource in the Dark Millennium box is cards. Psychic power cards, warp cards, strategy cards, vehicle cards, counters, and templates. And let's not forget the vehicle datafax cards, which were essential for play, since all the rules were on these rather than in your codex. 60 psychic cards were divided into 10 decks. These expanded, or rather completed, the psychic rules for 40k at the time. There were 5 sets composed of 8 cards each, namely the Orcs, Eldar, Librarian, Inquisitor and Adeptus sets. Sets for Tzeentch, Slaanesh, Nurgle, Squats and Tyranids had 4 cards each. There's also the Warp cards, which have a different function. We'll discuss those in depth later. 18 strategy cards were also included. Players would receive these towards the start of the battle, to add a spot of unexpected spicy sauce to your grimdark tapas. Dark Millennium came with additional Wargear and vehicle cards to add to your units. Some of these were brand new, some of these were card versions of Wargear also written into Codex army lists, and some replaced existing cards in the base game. In which case, the new version with any points and rules changes superseded the first. There were 55 new Wargear cards, too many to go into detail about here, but these were given to characters to make them more powerful, and generally to dial the hero hammer factor up to 11. The cards have on them the rules, points values, and restrictions as to which factions may use them, though some are universal. In White Dwarf issue 171, Andy Chambers divides the list of Wargear cards into 3 categories. 1. Essentials. This includes force fields for protection and some choice weapon options, specifically the demon weapon for chaos, the custom blaster for the orcs, and ancient weapons such as the executioner or bright lance for the Eldar. He also recommends force weapons for psychers. 2. Enhancements, which are more weapons, especially those that make characters nastier in combat, and buffs, such as the jump pack for movement, or friends on for get your character high in combat. 3. Cunning ploys, which includes things like warp jump to get your characters to the right place at the right time, or fancy grenades like Rad and Stasis. Vehicle cards are basically Wargear cards but for vehicles, and there are 10 in this set. For Imperial vehicles, we have Bulldozer Blade, Heavy Flamer, Hunter Killer Missile, and Stormbolters. For the Orcs, Squeak Fuel Injector and Custom Force Field, and for no one in particular, Null Shield, Reinforced Armor, Searchlight, and Supercharged Engine. If there are others you know of, they probably came in the base game, or an Army's Codex, or in White Dwarf magazine. 24 vehicle cards also furnished this set. Some were new, giving players a chance to roll out their big tracks and walkers onto the battlefield properly. but any with the same name as the ones in the original box set were meant to replace those. A notable change is for the Space Marine Rhino and Land Raider. The cards that came with the 40k base game could transport Dreadnoughts, but the new ones could not, which makes sense when you think the Dreadnought models changed from something like this to something like this. Dark Millennium included 9 counters which are used for various purposes. There are 6 rad markers which are used in conjunction with rad grenades to mark their area of effect, drawn at random whenever they are needed. The traps and virus markers are used in conjunction with specific strategy cards. The last counter is a marker to place as a reminder that a model has been affected by the Slaanesh psychic powers Acquiescence, Fleshy Curse, or Beam of Slaanesh. Several card templates are included in the set. A foot-shaped crater, to be used with the Orc psychic power De Crunch, and it's double-sided, so you can deploy Gork's left or right foot to stamp down on your enemies. I wonder which foot is more potent. Another template is for Eldritch Storm and Force Dome, a 3-inch circle with one side for each effect. Death Wave is another Orc psychic power with a template, a semicircle with another semicircle cut out in the centre. The inner circle is designed to enclose the base of the Orc Weird Boy, and the template then moves away from the caster in a straight line when the power goes off. It continues to move in later turns, so the original orientation should be preserved. A lone cone-shaped template, somewhat like a heavy flamer template, is decorated with lightning and is for the Eldar power Destructor. The flip side with rolling green clouds is for the Chaos power Stream of Corruption. Both templates are used like a flamer template in their first turn. Stream of Corruption only deals damage as it is cast, but Destructor moves forward away from the caster in each psychic phase, so again, it is important to keep it pointing in the right direction. The Adeptus power Gate uses 2 rectangular cards with rounded corners. They can be clipped into bases to enable them to stand upright, and act as openings to a portal connecting the 2 locations on the battlefield where they are placed. Finally, 2 2-inch circular templates are available to mark the effect of their respective powers. One template is for Smite and Firestorm of Tzeentch, another for Hellfire and Machine Curse. Their respective sides are suitably decorated for the power they convey. Now, Dark Millennium introduces additional rules to the Warhammer 40k 2nd edition experience. Optional rules? Well, that's up to you. Recommended rules? Definitely. Remember what that White Dwarf article said. It was meant to be this way. The Dark Millennium way. Which should be a street name, I think. The main rulebook also states this, conceding that the rules for psionics in the 40k rulebook are a shortened version of the Dark Millennium rules. The rulebook even tells you to expect Dark Millennium in the near future, and in my experience, Warhammer 40k 2nd edition is incomplete without at least the psychic rules from this expansion. The shortened rules for psychic powers that came with the starter set state that there are 4 levels of Psyker, and for each level of psychic ability, they may have 1 psychic power that they can use during that particular battle. This is the same as with Dark Millennium. However, the rulebook only contains 6 psychic powers, and players can choose which ones they take. Both players can cast powers per turn, 1 per Psyker, rolling a d6 and adding their mastery level, -1, to check if the psychic power works. Players are aiming to roll whatever the power specifies. It goes off on a 4+, for example. However, after modifiers, a roll of 1 is still a fail. If these rules seem a bit bland, it's because they are, in my opinion anyway. That is, compared to the Dark Millennium rules, which take up around half of the Dark Millennium rulebook. In short, these turn the psychic phase into its own little card game, which simulates the ebb and flow of warp power, and the Psykers attempt to harness it for their own machinations. Your Psykers have 1 power per mastery level. Powers are represented by cards, and there are 10 decks of cards. Cards are dealt randomly at the beginning of the game, 1 per mastery level, but any or all of these can be discarded to obtain a random replacement, which then must be kept even if the player doesn't like it. Most of the time, players will work with 1 set of cards between them. Therefore, cards need to be distributed in a certain order. Each Psyker has a primary discipline, and could have 1 or more tertiary disciplines, When dealing out psychic powers, all primary powers are dealt first, starting with the Psyker with the highest mastery level, and working down through the mastery levels. It doesn't say this, but the rules imply it. If there are ties, then a d6 roll is used to determine priority, so if both players are orcs, their weird boys cannot have both the same powers, for example. Once all the primary powers are dealt, the process is repeated with the tertiary powers. Of course, this rigmarole is significantly simplified if players have different disciplines, in which case, order of dealing can be done at the same time. At least one power must be taken from the primary discipline. The implication is that once this criterion is fulfilled, Psykers can take the rest of their powers from the primary deck, or tertiary, or any combination of the aforementioned. For example, Space Marine Librarians have Librarian powers as their primary discipline, obviously, and their tertiary disciplines are Inquisition and Adeptus powers. So a level 3 Librarian could choose to take all of his powers from the Librarian powers deck, or maybe one from Librarian, one from Inquisition, and one from Adeptus. Actually, there are many combinations he could have, as long as at least one is taken from the primary discipline. Players should keep their psychic power cards secret until they are used. Powers can be used multiple times through the game, though there are means to remove a psychic power from a player's possession for the rest of the game. The psychic phase of each turn has 3 steps. 1. Determine warp flux. 2. Deal warp cards. 3. Use psychic powers. To determine warp flux, 2d6 are rolled typically. I say this because the rules also say that once players feel more comfortable with the psychic rules, they can agree to increase this value to say 3d6 or 4d6. I inferred from this last paragraph it should be d6 per psyker, or maybe it's meant to be a maximum of d6 per psyker. Anyway, that's by the by, since I've never played with more than 2d6 warp flux, so for the purpose of this explanation, I'm just going to say it should be 2d6. The value rolled is the number of warp cards that are dealt to players, starting with the player whose turn it is. These warp cards can be spent to cast certain powers, or nullify opponents' attempts to cast, or enhance one's own powers in some way. It depends on the card played, and we'll have a look at some shortly. In the next step, psychic powers are used thusly. The player whose turn it is picks a psyker, and they can play one of the powers they own, paying the force value using force cards, at which point the power will work unless the opposing player nullifies it. Force cards are discarded once played, and the instructions on the psychic power are followed. Some powers have a one-time effect when they are cast, while some are persistent effects, until they end or are nullified. Once the first psyker has gone, the player whose turn it is not gets to do the same thing with one of their psykers. Play alternates in this fashion until both players have no more powers to use, or if they are unable to cast any more powers. Play may also be stopped by the special warp card energy drain. We'll get onto that. So let's have a look at the warp cards themselves. Most cards in the deck are force cards. These are simply currency to play psychic powers. However, there are 7 other special cards. The Nullify card allows a player to cancel out a psychic power, either when a psyker is attempting to cast it, or to eliminate a persistent power in play. Typically, a roll of 4, 5 or 6 is needed to cancel the power. However, this value is modified depending on the relative mastery of the 2 psykers battling it out, i.e. the caster and the castee. If the psyker nullifying the power has a higher mastery level than the one casting, you get a +1 bonus to nullify, meaning he will cancel the power on a roll of 3, 4, 5 or 6. A -1 penalty is applied if the psyker attempting to nullify the power has a lower mastery level than the one casting it. In this case, a power is nullified on a roll of a 5 or 6. Multiple nullify cards can be used to attempt to nullify a single power. It is assumed that the first nullify is attempted by your highest level psyker, and then the next lowest level, and so on. If all your psykers have attempted to nullify the power and failed, then more nullify cards can be played, but they will only nullify on a roll of a 5 or 6. Nullify cards only work against psychic powers and cannot nullify other nullify cards. The Destroy power card can be held onto rather than discarded at the end of the turn. If a psychic power is used against one of your psykers, or a model within 6 inches of one of your psykers, this card can be played immediately to prevent it taking effect. The power is instantly and automatically nullified. In addition, there's a chance that the psychic power that was nullified could be discarded from the game. Both players secretly roll a d6 and choose a number of force cards they are willing to sacrifice from their hand. Players then reveal their total score. If the one using the destroy power card has the higher value, then the power is destroyed. If the value was equal or lower, then the caster gets to keep the power and it is not destroyed. Energy Drain. This can be played at any time during the current psychic phase instead of using a psychic power card. 4 warp energy is sucked away, causing the psychic phase to end immediately. Warp cards in players' hands are discarded, even those that can normally be retained from turn to turn, and any stored in force weapons are also discarded. All powers that are currently in play are instantly and automatically nullified. I like to call this the "I'm taking my ball home" card. Reflection. This card can be retained from turn to turn. It can be played against a psyker or a model within 6 inches of one of your psykers. The power is automatically reflected 4d6 inches back in a straight line towards the psyker who used it. The effect passes over terrain, but affects the first eligible target in its path. Demonic Attack. When an enemy player plays a psychic power, Demonic Attack can be played, which represents a demonic entity attempting to seize the enemy psyker and drag them away into the warp. The power attempting to be played is nullified, unless it was being played with ultimate force, and the enemy psyker must roll a d6. On a 4, 5 or 6, they've managed to slip away from the demon, but on a 1, 2 or 3, the psyker is dragged screaming into the warp and killed. Note that the value that they need to roll can be modified. The psyker adds his mastery level to the dice roll, and deducts the number of force cards he played with the psychic power he was attempting to use. In squads with psykers, only one model is affected by this. Grey Knights and Weird Boys are only killed on the roll of a 6, since they don't have time for demons. Psychic Duel. Both players roll a d6 and add their psyker's mastery level to that. The highest total wins, and the loser randomly loses a psychic power. Draws lead to no effect. Finally, there's Ultimate Force, which sounds like some kind of 80s Saturday morning TV show. This card counts as 3 force cards worth of wallop behind a psychic power, and when using Ultimate Force, the power cannot be nullified, reflected, or destroyed, though in future turns, the power can be nullified as normal, for example, if it is a persistent power. And those are the force cards. If all of your psykers die, you cannot play any more psychic powers. However, you can still use nullify cards, it's just they'll only work on a roll of a 5 or 6. I'm not going to go through all the different kinds of psychic powers in the game, but I will mention the categories that they are divided into. First, there's the shooting type psychic attacks, which are subdivided into the strikes the first model in its path kind of power, and the draw a straight line kind of power. Some powers affect single models, and some affect multiple models. For instance, if they use a template, which many do. Some psykers require a player to roll under the characteristics such as movement or initiative. On such tests, a 6 always fails. When a psychic power requires a leadership test to be made, the leadership value must be of the target unit, which cannot be buffed through, say, some kind of reroll from a chaplain or banner, nor can they be increased due to the presence of an army commander within 12 inches. There's powers that remain in play, which I have alluded to before. Some only affect hand-to-hand combat, and some affect vehicles. Pages 14 to 17 in the Dark Millennium book detail the different powers, and they are varied, flavourful, and sometimes completely crackers. But that's why, of all the editions of Warhammer 40k, I think the 2nd edition does the psychic phase the best. When using Orc Psykers, the rules for the psychic phase are slightly different. Orc players draw their powers from the Weird Boy deck only. Again, 1 power per mastery level. Weird Boys have a chance of getting more warp power than that provided by their warp cards alone. In the psychic phase, the Orc player should check to see how many Orc or Gretchen models are within 12 inches of the Weird Boy. These will give the Weird Boy some Wah power. Any number of Gretchen bestows 1 power. Up to 5 Orcs, 2 power. Up to 10 orcs, 3 power. Over 10 orcs or any number of mad boys, 4 power. These are not cumulative. Only the highest value applies. However, +2 is added if any orcs, Gretchen or mad boys took part in hand-to-hand combat in the previous turn. This is because orcs busting heads in hand-to-hand combat generates more war power. Once the war power total has been determined, the orc player rolls a d6 and adds the Weird Boy's mastery level to it. If he rolls more than the total, he's managed to harness the war power. The benefits of this is that he draws an extra warp card for every 4 or more war power. In addition, he can counter every warp card as if it was a force card if he wishes, which gives him more flexibility when choosing which cards to spend to use psychic powers. If the orc player rolls less than or equal to the war power, he must roll on the Edbangers table with a single d6. The result of this roll varies considerably. Best case scenario, he has to discard a warp card, or slightly worse, your opponent picks a random one to discard. It may be that he can't cast any powers that turn, or that he forgets a random psychic power. On the worst side of things, any model in base contact with the Weird Boy may explode if they fail a toughness test. The most likely victims of this will be the Weird Boy's minders, who must always stay in base contact with him. The absolute worst case scenario is a roll of a 1, Edbang, where the Weird Boy's head explodes, and there's a chance that other nearby models may suffer the same fate if they fail a toughness test. By the way, head explosion cannot be prevented by an armor save, nor mitigated by having more than 1 wound. The Dark Millennium book also has an entry for warp heads, a level 4 psyker accompanied by 4 minders. The entry in Codex Orcs is identical to this, but bear in mind that the Codex was released a few months later, so Dark Millennium gave players a chance to go proper Edbangers a few months early. In contrast, the Orc Weird Boy is only a level 2 psyker. Before Grey Knights were their own 40k faction, they were a side order of Terminators that could accompany a main course of some other Imperial army, Space Marines or Guard for example. Actually, they were part of the Imperial Agents army list from the Black Codex, but I suppose they could be taken as allies by other armies. The Dark Millennium rulebook gave additional rules for these models, bringing them up to date with the psychic rules in this book. A Grey Knight's Terminator squad consists of 5 Grey Knights armed with Nemesis force weapons, wearing Terminator armor. They may be given Aegis suits for 50 points per squad, which confers a 4+ save against psychic attacks. They may also take Refractor Fields to give them a 5+ unmodifiable save. They can take a Land Raider to ride in for 220 points, or they can be teleported into battle, though the points value is increased by 50%. The points values for Grey Knights depends on their mastery level, as you can see here. The entire squad counts as a single psyker in effect, with the mastery level diminishing as casualties are taken. The mastery level also determines the strength bonus they receive with their Nemesis force weapons, which is +1 strength in hand-to-hand combat per mastery level of the squad. The mastery level of the squad can never exceed the number of models in it, so a squad with mastery level 4 suffering 2 casualties, and therefore leaving 3 squad members, becomes mastery level 3. A squad with mastery level 2 would be unaffected by casualties until there was only 1 Grey Knight left, and then it would have a mastery level of 1. Sometimes this may mean that psychic powers will need to be discarded as the squad takes damage. When casting powers, they don't always work on the whole squad unless the power says so. A player has to nominate 1 model as the caster to avoid any confusion. However, the Inquisition power Aura of Fire and the Librarian powers Teleportation and Psychic Shield will affect the whole squad if used successfully. Page 26 of the Dark Millennium rulebook gives rules for demons and psychic powers, though what it says here is repeated in the Chaos Codex. Greater demons have all 4 of the powers of their discipline. However, this does not prevent other Chaos Demons or Chaos Magi from having these powers, which is one of the few circumstances where specific psychic powers can be used by more than 1 model. Like Grey Knights, units of lesser demons have psychic powers, which can end up being discarded as the squad takes damage. The number of demons in the unit determines the mastery level of the unit as shown by this table. This table also shows when psychic powers will be discarded due to mastery levels decreasing as damage is taken, which is different to how Grey Knights work. While here it infers that psychic powers for demons are drawn at random, Codex Chaos specifies which powers the units of demons will have at certain mastery levels. Strategy cards. As mentioned earlier, Dark Millennium came with 18 strategy cards to represent luck, fate, and cunning ploys which may affect the battle. It says after the terrain has been set up, but before players start to deploy their troops. One strategy card is dealt to each player for every 1,000 points or part of 1,000 points in their force. So for example, if 2 players were about to fight a battle with 2 1,500 point armies, each player will be dealt 2 strategy cards. If 3 players were going to fight a battle with one force of 4,000 points, battling 2 smaller forces of 2,000 points each, the player with 4,000 points would be dealt 4 strategy cards, and the other 2 players would be dealt 2 each. Depending on the card, they may have an effect on deployment, or some other effect which is resolved before the game has begun proper. I remember fondly, for instance, when my opponent played the Delayed card, which meant that my Chaos Land Raider, full of Chaos Terminators and my Lord, could not enter the battlefield on the first turn, significantly delaying my strategy. Of course, I got him back in a later game, when I was able to resurrect one of my dead units, and also booby-trap one of his. A player can of course ignore their strategy cards if they want to, but why would you do that? Playing them is usually a right laugh, and if you want a balanced competitive game, I would set them aside, along with the rest of this edition probably. Speaking of a laugh, the set I bought is missing one card, which is none other than the famous Virus Outbreak card, a card so broken that an article in White Dwarf told players to tear up that very card, and I suspect that the previous owner of this set did exactly that. Andy Chambers himself even issued a formal apology for designing it. I'll leave an image of it here for a few seconds, for you to understand why it was banned such. This card could potentially single-handedly cripple an opponent's army. A reading of the rules for virus grenades shows why. When a model is killed by a virus grenade, it can affect other models d6 inches away, which then affect all models d6 inches away from them. You can see the chain reaction effect this weapon would have, and how it would be excruciating to resolve with roll after roll after roll. Drop on a blob of Gretchen, or Termagants for instance, and away you go. One beautiful strategy card, for instance, is the card's special issue, which randomly gives one of your characters a Wargear card from your collection, ignoring most of the usual restrictions. This means it's totally possible for your Imperial Guard Lieutenant to obtain Orc Telescopic Legs, or an Orc Warboss to be furnished with an Eldar Bright Lance. If you have played with any fun combinations like this, then I'd love to hear what they were. Write them down in the comments. The next section in the rules is a summary of rules for vehicle squadrons and support weapon batteries. There's a lot of rules here, and I'm not going to read every one. Nobody wants that. But the broad strokes are that if a support weapon is 100 points or less, then these rules detail how you should form your support weapons into batteries with their own coherency rules, break test rules, and how victory points are scored when they are destroyed, though this is mentioned again in the victory point tables. There's a similar section on vehicle squadrons, their coherency rules, their movement rules, and what victory points they are worth. Coherency, by the way, is 6 inches for both weapons and vehicles, and models are counted as destroyed if they are out of coherency at the end of the game. Vehicle cards are Wargear cards but for vehicles, improvements made to your motor pool by tech priests or mech boys or whatever. The card allows you to modify your vehicles. Each card shows the points costs as well as the rules and limitations for using that particular piece of equipment. Some are faction specific, while others can be used with all factions. There's no limit to the number of vehicle cards you can have for a particular vehicle, and unlike the Wargear cards, the vehicle cards can be duplicated within a force. However, no more than one vehicle may have the same combination of vehicle cards. So you can't have 2 rhinos each with a hunter-killer missile, but you can have one with a hunter-killer missile and another with a hunter-killer missile and reinforced armor. They also say here that each modification should be represented on the model, such as bigger exhaust pipes or a supercharged engine. However, just so you know, I would be fine with you using the card alone without the conversion. I'm nice like that. And then there's this section on designing and converting your own vehicles. They even suggest buying third-party products here, using the bits inside to customize your own kits. Would you believe it? Now, if you were hoping for a comprehensive guide here with the points for this, that and the other, you'll be disappointed. This isn't 3rd edition chapter approved after all. Instead, they say you should start with an existing vehicle data card and work with your opponent to decide what the details should be. This table tells you the points values to deduct and the points values to add on for replacing weapons. They tell you not to go overboard, but make a few small changes and then playtest, tweaking as necessary. They do say to be wary about increasing armor values. There should always be a weakness a chap with a crack grenade can exploit. Speaking of vehicles, there's a random section here on Space Marine Dreadnoughts. If you've read the sections in the Space Marine Codices on Dreadnoughts, you've basically covered this section. But its inclusion makes sense when you consider the timings. The first Dreadnought model of the Boxnaught type was released in November 1993, which is after the main rules, but before any codices. So the Dark Millennium rules, also before any codex, was probably a stopgap measure, giving rules on the various weapons available. You see, they would behave differently compared with the same weapons but in different situations. For example, both the Assault Cannon and the Stormbolter can ignore the first jam rolled on the sustained fire dice each turn, which is an improvement over the Terminator carried Assault Cannon. Also, the Multi-Melter can fire in 2 modes, regular melter mode or as a heavy flamer, and the Power Fist has a special tear attack, which gives it a +2 modifier when rolling on the damage chart of a vehicle after penetration. Victory point tables in Dark Millennium show the victory points per unit destroyed or damaged that you would score. There was a way of calculating victory points in the base rules, but these are considered suitable only for smaller games, while the Dark Millennium rules handle larger games better. Points are cumulative for each row. For example, if a squad worth 150 points is wiped out, 2 victory points are scored, one for 50% damage, and another for being wiped out. There's a table for vehicles too. A vehicle is counted as disabled if it can't move, and all of its weapons are destroyed. Or if all of its crew have been killed, or have dismounted from the vehicle. Interestingly, a cunning player could game this system somewhat, having many characters less than 50 points, for example, because they would yield no victory points when killed. And some players, when making lists, may create squads under the next threshold to avoid them conceding more victory points, or so I have heard. If you know what I mean and have any experience of this, do let me know in the comments. The back few pages are Citadel catalogue pages, which show some of the older range of miniatures still available at launch. The Raider of Land, for example, and these gorgeous Orc models which always fetch a high price second hand. Many of the models shown seem to be psychers or vehicles, which makes sense, since Dark Millennium was geared towards those kind of units. And of course the inside covers have some gorgeous minis painted by the Heavy Metal team. I'll give you a moment to admire these. It's always nice to see a little love for the squats. Which one is your favourite though? And let's not forget this pant-wettingly good photograph on the back of the Ultramarines and Blood Angels. Now that is tasty. So that's what Dark Millennium is about. Psychic powers, vehicle cards, various model upgrades, and some additional rules, which you may or may not end up using, depending if your force has, say, Grey Knights, or vehicle squadrons, or support weapons. Of course, when playing 2nd edition 40k, you and your opponent can leave out rules if you like. The Miniscape police are hardly going to bust you for not playing any psychers or vehicles. That's the beauty of tabletop gaming. They can be fun sandboxes if you want them to be. You don't need to use every rule in every game if you don't want to. My friends and I rarely used Dark Millennium in the 90s, because the content of the starter box alone was still significant. But now, I always like to play with the psychic rules from this set. I love the mini card game every turn, the back and forth between the psychers, attempting to form something to their advantage from warp energy. There can be some mind games between the two players as well, bluffing and baiting. Should I play my most destructive power first and risk it being nullified? Should I bait out the nullified with a small power? Will I have enough cards to do both? Might my opponent shut down the whole turn with an energy drain before I can get off that decisive power? The choices are what make it interesting. This is why I love this phase in 2nd edition, especially because both players can have a big impact on the game. Some people may think, you know, I'd love to pick up this long out of print expansion, but it's out of print, man. And I bet second-hand prices are eye-watering. Well, I would say there are feasible alternatives, which I explore in another video, Get into 2nd edition 40k. So that is my take on Dark Millennium. I will say this video has been a long time coming. I've spent about 18 months putting this one off, but I'm glad I did so, because since my initial idea, I've managed to get several games in with it, so I feel I have more experience now. I know there are some details of cards I have missed, but if there's a taste for me going through every Wargear card and psychic power individually, then I can make separate videos on those. And if you're into older Warhammer 40k stuff, or you would like to learn more about this wonderful era, then please consider perusing my back catalogue of videos. There are many at this stage. What a great way to fritter away a rainy day. And with that, I'd better go paint some more minis. Take care, and thanks for watching.